Different power training zones are responsible for different physiological adaptations, so having a basic understanding of which zone elicits which adaptations will either help you build better plans or better understand a coached or off-the-shelf plan that you are following. So stay tuned to learn a little bit more about the basics of this particular topic. When building training plans for the athletes that I coach, my starting point is either a polarized or a pyramidal model, but more often than not, a combination of both of these over the course of the season. Athletes with full-time jobs will probably need to do their midweek training, at least for the majority of the year, on the static trainer. Therefore, the pyramidal model is my preferred approach for these athletes, with weekends reserved for those long rides predominantly in Zone 2. The athletes that I coach are not crit racers, time trialists or cyclocross racers requiring event-specific plans. They're simply club riders who just want to be a little bit quicker on the group ride, but who also might do the occasional sportif, Gran Fondo or foreign cycling trips such places as the Alps or Mallorca. So the type of training and zones that we focus on is dictated by the aforementioned goals and time constraints of fitting in training around a full-time job and family life. And it is those zones that are the focus of this video. So before I go any further, here's a quick reminder of those widely used 7 zones devised by Dr. Andrew Coggan and how they fit within a 3-zone model. So here you have again the 7 Coggan training zones based on power, and we arrive at these as a percentage of FTP. So we've got zone 1, which is 55% or less of FTP. Zone 2, endurance, 55 to 75%. Zone 3, tempo, 75 to 90%. Zone 4, lactate threshold, 90 to 105%. Zone 5, VO2 max, 105 to 120%. Zone 6, anaerobic capacity, 120 to 150%. And then finally, Zone 7, neuromuscular power, which doesn't have a power target as such because it's simply an all-out effort as hard as you can. Now, not that it actually matters what you call each zone, but I do like the titles that High North Coaching have given to each of the 7 Coggan training zones. And here they are. So you have Zone 1, active recovery. Zone 2, extensive aerobic. Zone 3, intensive aerobic. I do like that little differentiation between those 2 zones there. Zone 4, lactate threshold. Zone 5, aerobic capacity, which Zone 5 VO2 max has long been called aerobic capacity, and that is a title I particularly like because zones 1 to 5 are aerobic, with Zone 5 sitting at the top end of that range. Then we move into Zone 6, anaerobic capacity, or your VLA max, and then finally Zone 7, neuromuscular. The reason for me going over the 7 Coggan training zones once again is to link them to a 3-zone training intensity distribution model, which we see here. So looking at this curve of power compared to lactate concentration, we can see that we can divide the curve up into 3 zones, which forms the basis of polarized training plans. And what we're looking for are these 2 turning points. Starting off with this first one, which would demarcate where VT1, ventilatory threshold 1, or LT1, lactate threshold 1, occurs, which are slightly different, but for our purposes we can regard them as broadly the same. And that also equates to, for most riders, the top end of Zone 2. And operating below this ceiling, you will then predominantly be burning fats as your fuel. Once you cross the threshold though of VT1/LT1, you'll start to bring in carbs into the equation as a fuel source. So that is quite a key turning point in terms of demarcating training zones, in terms of developing your fat oxidation. Further up the scale, we've got this other turning point where lactate accumulation starts to rise rapidly, and this takes place above your functional threshold power, your FTP, or your maximal lactate steady state. It's at that point where you are said to be in balance, processing the waste products at the same rate that you're producing them. And when you step above that particular intensity, then you're on borrowed time. You're not processing the waste products as fast as you're producing them. So depending how far above that turning point you are, will determine how long it will take you to reach VO2 max. When we relate those turning points to places on the 7 Coggan power training zones, this is where they are.
We've got LT1, VT1, the lower turning point, which for most athletes is around about the top end of zone 2. Obviously, we could do a lactate test or a ventilatory threshold test to get a more accurate idea of where that sits. And the other turning point is around about your FTP. So that is where they sit in relation to those 7 Coggan power training zones.
Throughout the rest of this video, the power training zones that I'll be referring to are the Coggan zones 1 to 7. Whenever I need to cross-reference to the 3-zone model, then I'll either talk about below LT1, above LT2, or in between those thresholds. Let's start off with the all-important Zone 2, which is where you should be spending the majority of your training time. Why? Because it has quite a few key benefits and adaptations which are not readily available in other zones, and a really important one is fat oxidation. By driving down your propensity to burn carbs as a fuel, you increase the power at which this begins to take place. Driving down your lactate production at this lower level will contribute to raising your FTP further up the scale. It's not uncommon for newcomers to cycling to be quite glycolytic in nature, so whilst their fat oxidation improves and develops over time, they will need to be more diligent with taking fuel on board during rides. Another important Zone 2 adaptation is centered around those really trainable Type 2A muscle fibers. As endurance athletes, we ideally want to adapt these to be more akin to our Type 1 slow twitch fibers. And because the Type 1 fibers are quite fatigue resistant, we need to include longer rides in order to fatigue them. Once you've fatigued your Type 1 fibers over the course of a long ride, some of the workload will be shifted to your Type 2A. So, after you have recovered from your ride, the Type 1 fibers will be a little bit more trained and stronger, and therefore more fatigue resistant in future, and your Type 2A will have adapted to be slightly more akin to your Type 1. It's not uncommon for newcomers to cyclists for their Type 2A to be more akin to their Type 2X fast twitch fibers, which is why they will often have a good sprint compared to a relatively moderate endurance ability. In the past, Zone 3 has been much maligned. It was argued that it was the least efficient zone, in so much as the gains you reaped came at a relatively high fatigue cost. But structured Zone 3 work can still form part of a good and effective all-round training plan. It is possible to target those Type 2A muscle fibers via slightly shorter rides and sessions conducted in Zone 3, or otherwise known as tempo, or by including some Zone 3 efforts within a Zone 2 ride. So including sessions of this nature could be a useful workaround for time-crunched athletes who aren't able to commit to more than one long Zone 2 ride each week. But it is important to remember that you will be sacrificing the fat oxidation aspect with a Zone 3 session instead of a Zone 2 session. So if you do have the time for those longer Zone 2 rides, then they should still be part of your training diet and your go-to. Perhaps the main reason behind Zone 3 sometimes being referred to as the grey zone was that too many athletes go too hard on their supposedly easy Zone 2 rides, and then as a result of that, perhaps cannot go hard enough as they need to on their harder sessions, and the result being that all their training ends up falling in the middle zone between LT1 and LT2 instead of it being polarized as their coach intended. In one of my previous videos, I go through some of the benefits of these really long steady rides in more detail. But an important point to remember is that these adaptations occur as a function of duration rather than intensity. So, going harder than you really need to on these rides is of no real benefit. In fact, by working above LT1, you'll be missing out on developing that all-important fat oxidation. And in addition to that, going a tad too hard might result in you curtailing the session. And it is a session where duration is more beneficial than intensity. So save the intensity for those interval sessions, which we'll look at next. For the athletes that I coach, the majority of their interval training throughout the year takes place in Zone 4, aka threshold or lactate threshold, and Zone 5, aka VO2 max or aerobic capacity. And due to the nature of their events and cycling goals, there isn't too much need to be focusing on training to increase their maximal glycolytic rate, as this may have a detrimental effect on their FTP. So let's start off with Zone 4, lactate threshold. So how we structure: 1, the intervals within this zone, and 2, whereabouts within the zone they sit, alongside 3, the duration of both the intervals themselves and the recovery valleys, as well as adjusting the cadence target for some sessions, will dictate which particular aspect of cycling physiology we will be developing by sessions in Zone 4. A perennial target for a lot of cyclists is to raise FTP, or fractional utilization. Your FTP is closely linked to lactate, so by driving down your propensity to produce it in the first place, which is achieved by those long zone 2 rides below LT1, along with developing your ability to both shuttle and tolerate it at the other end, will serve to improve your FTP. One of my go-to sessions in this zone for improving lactate clearance are over-unders. When you understand more about these and how they work and the key parts of them, you can use a bit of imagination to develop some variety within them over the course of a training year, which is something that I do for the athletes that I coach. Another adaptation we are seeking to achieve via Zone 4 intervals is lactate tolerance, and we can also develop this by carefully structured sessions in those higher zones. Finally, muscular endurance and adaptation of type 2A fibers is also something we can use Zone 4 and even upper Zone 3 intervals to work on, especially for the time-crunched athlete who cannot do a long ride during midweek. And so onto, or should I say up to, Zone 5, more commonly known as VO2 max, but perhaps a better and more apt descriptor is aerobic capacity. Cycling is an aerobic sport, and as a cyclist it is better to produce power aerobically as much as you possibly can, because you will be able to sustain that power for much longer. Referring back to the 7 Coggan training zones, 5 of them are aerobic, with Zone 6 being classed as anaerobic and Zone 7 as neuromuscular. Zone 5 is the top of your aerobic range, and by stressing this, you get the trickle-down effect to those other zones. The higher your VO2 max, the greater your capacity to utilise oxygen, which means the higher the ceiling is of your aerobic ability. Your FTP is also dependent on your VO2 max. Assessing where your FTP sits in relation to your power at VO2 max, aka your fractional utilisation, can inform you where to direct some of your training blocks, because it could be that your power at VO2 max is the thing that is inhibiting growing your FTP. The good news is that VO2 max is trainable. Yes, at one time it was thought to be purely genetic, with the old saying, if you want a good VO2 max, choose your parents carefully. Yes, genetics do have a large contribution, but evidence suggests that whatever you have is trainable, so it is well worth the effort. Sadly, none of us are getting any younger, and as we age, particularly as we head beyond 50 years old, there are 3 things that are detrimental to performance: an increase in body fat, a decrease in lean tissue, i.e. muscle mass, and a reduction in our VO2 max or aerobic capacity. And it is the third of these which is the biggest contributor to a decline in performance. So as you do get older, don't neglect those short, hard Zone 5 interval sessions. Just accept you'll need more recovery days in between the sessions than you previously did when you were younger. The way you arrange intervals, especially the recoveries between them, can alter the physiological outcomes, which means that we can use Zone 6 and Zone 7 to elicit adaptations more commonly associated with other zones. For example, when you stack a series of sprints together, they become increasingly aerobic in demand as you work your way through them. It's also possible to utilise power outputs that are nominally Zone 6 and anaerobic to achieve an aerobic capacity or VO2 max workout by how you program and arrange the intervals. And if you're doing events where a high glycolytic rate is beneficial, then a more traditional and sustained interval in Zone 6 is the way to go. But bear in mind that increasing your glycolytic rate will negatively affect your FTP. We can also make use of Zone 7 in a similar way to Zone 6 by utilising it to enhance adaptations more associated with other zones. For example, studies have shown that the inclusion of sprints within an endurance ride can serve to further enhance endurance adaptations, which is one of the main ways I utilise Zone 7 with the majority of athletes that I coach. Lastly, and by no means least, Zone 1, which is commonly used for recoveries, whether in between hard intervals or as a 30 to 60 minute dedicated recovery ride. Now, many athletes either underutilise recovery rides or get them wrong by trying to squeeze in a bit more training by going too hard during them. Recovery is just an important aspect as is overload in making those fitness gains. In fact, you cannot make gains without either. Put simply, stress plus rest equals adaptation. Under-recovering and overtraining are the 2 same sides of a coin. If an athlete asks me for an additional session because more time has opened up in their schedule, I'll ascertain first if there's also a corresponding increase in time devoted to recovery before building it in. People respond to training stimulus at different rates, and it is essential to allow supercompensation to take place before the next session. Recovery rides of 30 minutes to an hour are a good inclusion in your training program. Not only do they promote recovery, the idea being that you clear waste products by activating the muscles, but not going so hard as to reintroduce more waste products, they can also help you maintain the rhythm and routine of training. Quite often, athletes are guilty of going too hard on their recovery rides due to a lack of discipline, particularly if they do these outdoors, which is why I suggest doing them on your static trainer, and always keeping in mind that it's almost impossible to go too easy on these sessions. So I hope that this video has helped you understand a little bit more about what is quite a complex and in-depth topic, and that you will now make use of what you've learned to make further improvements to your own training. If you have enjoyed this video, please leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you know of a friend whose training would also benefit from a little bit more knowledge and less speculation and guesswork and assumptions, then why not share this video with them as well? All that is left for me to say is thank you for watching, and remember to embrace the process to enjoy the ride. Take care. Goodbye.